Kansas City Mafia versus the Black Mafia Uprising. In the heart of America, Kansas City was once ruled not by politicians or police, but by shadows. The Kansas City Mafia, also known as the Civella crime family, had its grip on the city's vice: gambling, extortion, narcotics. But in the 1970s, a new power began to rise, one that threatened to shake the old order. They were young, streetwise, and hungry. Law enforcement called them the Black Mafia, and they wanted their piece of the pie. The Black Mafia wasn't a single organization, but a loose alliance of African-American gangsters and drug dealers operating in Kansas City's east side. As heroin flooded the streets in the early 70s, these local figures seized control of distribution in black neighborhoods, previously overlooked or underserved by the Italian mob. With growing profits came growing power, and with power came ambition. The Black Mafia started moving product into areas the outfit considered their own. The Civella crime family had ruled Kansas City's underworld for decades. Led by the legendary Nick Civella, the outfit controlled gambling halls, loan shark operations, and a lucrative heroin pipeline that stretched from Chicago to the Midwest. But the rise of the Black Mafia challenged that control. Street-level dealers stopped paying tribute. Heroin corners, once controlled by mob-backed intermediaries, were overtaken. The Mafia responded the only way they knew how: with violence. Between 1972 and 1976, Kansas City saw a wave of unsolved murders, firebombings, and daylight shootings. Black gang leaders were targeted in drive-bys. Known associates disappeared without a trace. In one case, a stash house was found burned to the ground, its occupants never identified. On the other side, the Black Mafia retaliated. Mob-connected clubs were robbed. Low-level outfit collectors were assaulted. A climate of fear gripped the city's criminal underworld. As the violence escalated, federal law enforcement took notice. The FBI launched surveillance on both sides, capturing conversations between mob captains discussing cleaning up the streets. In one wiretap, a capo referred to the black dealers as out of line, out of order, and about to be dealt with. But the new generation of street bosses weren't intimidated. They had numbers, firepower, and a willingness to die for their territory. By the late 1970s, the war began to burn out. Many leaders of the Black Mafia had been killed, arrested, or forced into hiding. The Civella family regained some control, but the streets were never the same. The era of centralized, controlled crime was fading, replaced by a fragmented landscape of gang rivalries and turf battles. The Black Mafia uprising was more than just a gang war. It was a sign of the times, a shift in power, a challenge to tradition, and a warning to the mob that the streets were changing. In Kansas City's dark history, few battles burned as hot or ended as messy as the war between the Old World Mafia and the rising street gangs of the 1970s. This was the beginning of the end for the mob's monopoly and the dawn of a new era of chaos. Kansas City Mafia versus the 12th Street Crips conflict. In the 1980s, Kansas City was a city in transition. The mob still held power in the shadows, but it was no longer alone. A new generation of criminals was rising, young, streetwise, and heavily armed. From the West Coast came a name that would change the face of gang warfare in the Midwest: the 12th Street Crips. Their arrival would spark a bloody and violent conflict with one of America's most entrenched crime syndicates, the Kansas City Mafia. For decades, the Civella crime family ran Kansas City with quiet authority. Under Nick Civella's leadership, the Mafia controlled gambling, union rackets, narcotics, and loan sharking across the metro area. But the 1980s brought crack cocaine, and with it, a tidal wave of street-level violence. The Italian Mafia focused on high-level narcotics profits, often overlooked inner-city distribution. That vacuum gave rise to new predators, among them the Crips. The 12th Street Crips were modeled after the notorious Los Angeles gang. Brought to Kansas City through prison transfers and street contacts, they set up shop quickly on the east side, pushing crack cocaine and recruiting heavily. They wore blue, carried automatic weapons, and answered to no one, especially not to the mob. They began operating openly on turf once indirectly controlled by the outfit, including key drug corners, street casinos, and strip clubs. The mob saw the Crips not just as a nuisance, but a threat to their revenue and reputation. When a Crip crew robbed a known mafia-controlled gambling house in 1984, it was a declaration of war. The Civella family responded the old-fashioned way. Enforcers, often bikers or hired muscle, were dispatched to track, intimidate, and eliminate the threat. Shootings erupted around Prospect Avenue and 18th Street. A car bomb tore through a vehicle linked to a suspected Crip lieutenant, and in one chilling incident, 2 Crip members were found executed, gangland style, near the river. The violence wasn't one-sided. The Crips fought back, attacking mafia-linked clubs, mugging outfit associates, and threatening mob-owned businesses. Drive-by shootings became common. Witnesses were too scared to talk. The streets of Kansas City were drenched in fear. The FBI and local law enforcement launched a gang task force. But they were caught between a powerful crime family and a fast-growing street army. By the late 1980s, the Civella family had begun to fracture, weakened by indictments, aging leadership, and the sheer unpredictability of the new gang landscape. The Crips, meanwhile, only grew in power. Their decentralized structure made them harder to eliminate, and their grip on the drug trade was expanding fast. The Kansas City Mafia had won battles, but it was losing the war. The 12th Street Crips didn't just bring crack and violence to Kansas City. They brought revolution. And in their wake, they left the once untouchable Kansas City Mafia struggling to hold on. In the shadows of power, new kings had risen, and the old world would never be the same. Kansas City Mafia versus the Bloods' encroachment. By the early 1990s, the Kansas City underworld was in flux. The once mighty Civella crime family, long the silent rulers of the city's rackets, were under federal pressure. But even as their influence waned, a new threat was rising, louder, younger, and far more violent. The Bloods had arrived, and they weren't asking for permission. Following the bloody turf battles with the 12th Street Crips in the 1980s, the Kansas City Mafia was bruised, but not broken. They had survived, for now, but peace was short-lived. In the early 1990s, blood-affiliated street gangs began pouring into Kansas City from California, bringing with them crack cocaine, AK-47s, and a reputation for brutality. They saw opportunity, and they were ready to take it. The Bloods didn't just settle in the inner city. They moved on mafia-controlled turf, key distribution corridors, gambling dens, and corners historically taxed by the outfit. These weren't the small-time street crews the Mafia had bullied for decades. The Bloods were organized, heavily armed, and growing fast. They established sets across Troost Avenue, Independence Avenue, and parts of the West Bottoms. The outfit, already weakened by indictments, aging leadership, and internal division, couldn't ignore the challenge. And they wouldn't. In 1992, tensions exploded. A known Bloods affiliate was gunned down outside a strip club linked to the outfit. 2 nights later, a Mafia-connected loan shark was shot execution-style in his driveway. The message was clear. The Bloods were not afraid. Kansas City plunged into a cold-blooded street war. The Mafia, drawing on old-school enforcers and biker connections, began targeting Bloods leaders through contract killings and arson attacks. In return, the Bloods stepped up their assaults, robbing mob-owned businesses, intimidating witnesses, and torching front operations. As the bodies piled up, the FBI and ATF launched coordinated operations. Undercover agents infiltrated both sides. Wiretaps captured outfit veterans speaking of cleanups and new blood needing lessons. But this wasn't the 1950s. The old rules no longer applied. The streets were ruled by chaos, not code. And the Bloods, decentralized, fast-moving, and fearless, were hard to stop. While the feds indicted mafia figures tied to violence, the Bloods simply replaced fallen members with younger, more aggressive recruits. By the mid-1990s, the Civella crime family was reeling. Top bosses were behind bars or dead. The remaining leadership had little control over the increasingly lawless streets. Meanwhile, the Bloods had carved out territory that once belonged to the outfit and weren't giving it back. It was more than a gang war. It was a passing of the torch, from tailored suits and coded language to red flags and automatic weapons. In Kansas City, the early 90s marked the fall of the old guard and the rise of a new generation of gang power. The Mafia had built an empire through quiet influence. The Bloods took theirs with fire and force, and in the end, only the streets remained. The Kansas City Mafia versus the North Side Syndicate showdown. By the dawn of the 2000s, the Kansas City Mafia was a shadow of its former self. The Civella crime family, once feared and untouchable, had been battered by indictments, surveillance, and time. But while the mob's old-school influence faded, a new criminal force emerged from the streets. Younger, harsher, and with no respect for the old codes of honor. They called themselves the North Side Syndicate, and they were ready to take over. The North Side Syndicate wasn't born in the smoke-filled back rooms of Italian restaurants. It rose in the alleys of North Kansas City, a loose alliance of young Black and Latino gangsters with one goal: control the city's underworld. They weren't interested in tradition. They were interested in domination, and they had the manpower, firepower, and street connections to pull it off. Drugs, weapons, underground parties, stolen cars. The syndicate moved quickly, swallowing up rackets the outfit had controlled for decades. The Mafia had always relied on quiet control, taxing drug dealers, running illegal poker games, and enforcing order through intimidation, not chaos. But the syndicate played by different rules. They weren't paying tribute to anyone. They started hijacking drug routes, robbing mob-run card games, and taking over protection rackets in Italian neighborhoods. They weren't afraid of the Mafia, and that made them dangerous. In 2004, things turned violent. A known mob associate was found shot execution style behind a Northland warehouse. Days later, a syndicate-linked stash house was burned to the ground. Police found bodies, but no answers. From there, the streets turned into a chessboard of blood. Mafia enforcers, younger men groomed to carry on the family legacy, started showing up at syndicate hangouts. Shots were fired outside nightclubs. A syndicate boss was nearly killed in a broad daylight ambush on Interstate 35. The war was on. As the violence escalated, the FBI launched a joint task force with ATF and Kansas City PD. Surveillance picked up conversations between old mob lieutenants ordering cleanups and syndicate leaders plotting revenge. Undercover agents began infiltrating both camps. Hidden cameras caught meetings at strip clubs, quiet sit-downs that ended in gunfire, and cash drops that disappeared into the night. In 2007, a major bust swept up over a dozen members from both sides, but the syndicate's decentralized nature made them harder to dismantle than the traditional mob hierarchy. By the end of the decade, the Kansas City Mafia was fractured. The last remnants of the Civella family had either aged out or gone underground. The North Side Syndicate, though bloodied, had survived, and in many ways had won. They now controlled the streets the mob once ruled with whispers and handshakes. But unlike the Mafia, the syndicate ruled through fear, not respect. Kansas City would never return to the quiet order of the old days. The North Side Syndicate didn't just challenge the Kansas City Mafia, they buried the last traces of its legacy. In the war between tradition and terror, the future belonged to the bold, the brutal, and the street-born. And in the 2000s, Kansas City learned, power has no loyalty, only survivors. Kansas City Mafia versus the South Side Soldiers War. By the 2010s, the Kansas City Mafia was no longer the iron-fisted empire it once was. The Civella crime family had been reduced to whispers and old legends. But every empire leaves behind something, a name, a neighborhood, a reputation, and in those cracks, a new force emerged. They called themselves the South Side Soldiers. A multi-ethnic street gang that didn't play by the old rules and didn't care who used to run the streets. Born out of poverty, prison politics, and fractured alliances, the South Side Soldiers began as a small-time crew in South Kansas City. But by the 2010s, they were no longer just another neighborhood gang. They were organized, armed, and rapidly expanding. Their business was extortion, robbery, methamphetamine, and they made it known that mafia-connected businesses were no longer off-limits. They started demanding street tax from stores, clubs, and restaurants in historic Italian neighborhoods. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. Though weakened, the Kansas City Mafia still had pride and a memory. For decades, the outfit had protected certain neighborhoods, not out of kindness, but control. The South Side Soldiers breaking that code was more than a challenge. It was an insult. What followed wasn't a public war. It was silent, surgical, and deadly. Old enforcers made calls, retired hitters came out of the shadows, and a younger generation of mob associates, raised on stories of the old days, began taking matters into their own hands. Shootings began to spike in South Kansas City. In 2012, a soldier enforcer was found burned in the trunk of a car parked near Blue River Road, a method straight out of the Mafia's playbook. Weeks later, a mob-linked bar was shot up by masked men. The message was clear: no one was backing down. Over the next year, dozens of violent incidents were linked to the brewing war: drive-bys, arsons, disappearances. Both sides denied involvement, but everyone on the street knew what was happening. As the bodies piled up, federal agencies reactivated long-dormant investigations into Kansas City's organized crime scene. Wiretaps captured snippets of coded messages. Surveillance footage showed known mob associates meeting with ex-convicts tied to the soldiers. A federal indictment in 2015 named members of both groups in a racketeering conspiracy. But many of the major players slipped through the cracks. The mob kept quiet. The soldiers grew bolder. By the late 2000s and 10s, the war cooled, but only because the lines had been redrawn. The Kansas City Mafia no longer dictated terms on the South Side. Their era of dominance had finally come to an end. The South Side Soldiers, though bloodied, emerged as one of the city's most feared and unpredictable forces. The new order had arrived. Ruthless, chaotic, and born from the streets, not the boardrooms of backroom cafes. In Kansas City, tradition died not with a bang, but with silence and fire. The mob's final war wasn't against a rival family. It was against a new generation that didn't play by the rules. And in the streets of the 2010s, only the bold survived.